Hello and welcome to our review of the business writing assignments. What I'm going to do in this video is just kind of give you a little bit of an understanding of what we're looking for, how to plan the assignments, and maybe a few tips here and there in terms of how to write them. In order to go through the assignments properly, the first thing I want to do is go through some of the relevant slides that are relevant to the course materials for some of the main goals to look for, and then we are going to segue that to a discussion of the assignments themselves. First of all, the importance of identifying a document's purpose. That's obviously very important. Near the outset of every document, you want to define your purpose. Defining your purpose, of course, helps keep the reader focused during the reading process and helps keeps you focused during the writing process, so that you'll include all relevant material, not put in irrelevant material, which is almost as important as including relevant material and organizing the text of the document effectively. Know your own purpose and be focused on your purpose throughout your writing. How you approach a writing very often depends on your audience. If you are expecting a positive reaction, you're writing something that you're giving good news and you're writing an email to your company saying everybody gets a raise or everybody gets next Tuesday off for no reason. Well, you can play up your ideas and be as direct as possible. Present your main topic first. If you're informing a student that the student will receive a scholarship, you can assume she'll be happy to receive the news. You can be direct and, of course, play up your ideas. On the other hand, what if you're writing something where you expect a negative reaction, either because you're criticizing somebody, demanding that somebody behave differently, giving somebody bad news? Well, there you want to be not quite as direct. You don't necessarily want to say, Dear Joe, you're fired. You want to be a little bit less direct than that, just to be nice. Use supporting evidence. That's important. Establish what it is you're relying on when you make these statements, when you insist on whatever it is you're insisting on. Use trustworthy testimonials. Use the quote that you're relying on in making this decision. Here's an example. If you're writing in the context of the management of a bank and you want to propose ideas that you think might not go over well, use data from other banks or provide statements from individuals whom even the reader trusts or respects. Some of the most important concepts in writing in general include being as clear as possible, using short, simple words rather than complex legalese words, vigor, which means sticking to your guns and being forceful, conciseness, rather than just saying the same thing 12 different times, and positive language. Positive in this context doesn't necessarily mean that you're giving good news. What positive means is that you're heading directly towards your message rather than being indecisive. Clarity means, of course, to be accurate, not to fudge. Tell the truth rather than trying to pull the wool over the reader's eyes. Facts and figures, whatever you're citing, have to be exact. And accuracy, which depends on not only what is said, but how it's said, and of course what is left unsaid. Tell the reader all the W's. Tell the reader, okay, what is going on? Who is it affecting? When does it take place? Where does it take place? And almost as importantly in a business context, why is it necessary? Clarity also includes using familiar words. Don't try to impress your reader with your vocabulary. The reader might be impressed with your education in vocabulary, but the reader might not get your message, or the reader may have to work harder to get your message. And the more the reader has to work to get your message, the less time the reader is going to sit there and pondering your message. Clarity includes being sharp and to the point with your language. One aspect of clarity is avoiding dangling expressions. After reading the proposal, a few problems occurred to me is not as good as, after reading the proposal, I noted a few problems. Think about it. Something like, I have money with which to purchase food with is not as good as, I have money to purchase food. It's more direct, it's more concise, it's more clear. Avoid unnecessary jargon. In the context of law, we call this legalese. But jargon in general means technical language. understood by people in that field. If you're writing to an audience that's broader than that field, you want to try to avoid legal terms or medical terms or technical terms, depending on who you're writing to. Make sure that whatever audience you have understands whatever technical language you use. When in doubt, use lay language. You can't go wrong with that. Clarity also means being as specific as possible. You were very late several times last year is not as good as you arrived for work at least 20 minutes late on the following dates. You may not necessarily have all that information, but to the extent that you do have information, I get this all the time when people email me saying I had a problem with 3 issues. Well, it's much better and much more helpful if you tell me what 3 issues you had a problem with. Be as precise as possible, be as clear as possible, to give the reader a much clearer understanding of exactly what the issue is. Try to avoid colloquialisms, cliches. Every effort will be made to fix the problem is not as good as, not as direct, not as concise as we will try to fix the problem. Every effort, of course, well, used all the time, is a little bit more cliche and not as direct. Avoid redundancies. In this sentence, the word again is redundant. When you're using the word repeat, to then use the word again, you're just repeating the same term for no reason. It's much better just to say not to repeat that mistake without using the word again. Using concise, simple words that are good words, obviously. You don't want to use words that are overly simplistic or sound babyish, but you also want to be as concise as possible. I have ascertained that our plant has commenced fabricating the indispensable circuits is not as good as I have learned that our plant has started making the needed circuits. They both say the same thing, but the second one probably takes about half the time to read and understand. Vigor in writing means powerful, means being direct. I bought 4 oranges rather than I bought several oranges is more direct. It gives the reader a more precise bit of information. Try not to use words that are vague. You may use them. There's nothing inherently wrong with using these words when you have no choice. But if you're using these words, think to yourself, is there any way that I can be more specific? If I say several, a number, substantial, a few, a lot, is there any way I can quantify it? Rather than saying a few, can I say 4? Rather than saying a lot of, can I say 12 or between 10 and 12. Between 10 and 12 is still better than a lot of. It's more specific. If I say substantial, can I quantify it? Can I say, there was a 47% increase rather than just saying there was a substantial increase? Or there was between a 25% and a 50% increase, still a lot better than just saying substantial. Create a mental picture by being as specific as possible. Rather than saying the person was emotional, say what that emotion was. Was the emotion anger? Was the emotion sadness? Was the emotion happiness? Rather than saying the clothing was a bright color, say what color it was. Was it bright yellow? Was it bright red? Was it bright green? New equipment can be replaced with what the new equipment is. A change in price, you can say the price increased or the price decreased, and then go ahead and say the percentage. The price decreased 8% is a lot better than saying that there was a price change. Cliches, generally speaking, you want to try to avoid. Cliches mean things that are colloquialisms, expressions, things like that. Avoid it like the plague, dead as a doornail, take the tiger by the tail. These are all things that are certainly appropriate for conversation. People use cliches all the time. I use cliches all the time, but it's not really appropriate in the context of a business memorandum. Business writing should be more formal and more specific. There are some other points over here. Now, these are buzzwords. I don't want to say that these are inappropriate necessarily. Certainly, I've seen these kinds of words appear very often in business memoranda and business writing. There's nothing inherently wrong with them, but they should be used with caution. Are you using a buzzword? Is it accurate? You know, if you say, for example, that we have a customer-centered strategy, are you just saying it because it sounds good, or are you saying it because you really can establish to the reader that what you're proposing is a customer-centered strategy? You know, are you using the word game plan because you're really proposing something that is a plan for how you're going to act, or are you kind of just using it because it sounds good and you've heard the term? Is it really mission critical, whatever it is that you're proposing? So these are things that I don't want to say that you shouldn't use them, but these kinds of buzzwords and these business buzzwords, but you should definitely be careful and be careful not to use them just because they sound good, but rather because you're sure that they're appropriate. Conciseness, which is part of Vigor, includes avoiding redundancies. I think we've already discussed this, which is a little ironic, I guess. Try to avoid saying combine the ingredients together, rather say combine the ingredients. A good trick would be don't use the word together if you've already used things that mean together, like assemble, combine, mix, merge, join, gather, cooperate, which all really imply together. Here are some examples of phrases that have really extraneous words. Repeat again, past history. There's only one kind of history, and that's past history. There's only one kind of facts, and that's true facts. Even a free gift, which you see all the time in advertising, when you're talking about a business communication, that is a redundancy. A gift, by definition, is free. We're going to try this over again. It's better to say it, we're going to try it over, or we're going to try it again, but to say over again is a redundancy. Here are some other examples of conciseness, and a link if you're interested. Be concise by using smaller phrases when you can. A number of can be replaced by some or many. And not only is some or many one word as opposed to 3 words, it's also more precise. Many says more than just a number of. A number of could be any number. Many means a large number. Some means a small number. Afford an opportunity can be replaced by allow or let, etc., etc. At the present time, for example, which you see a lot, kind of a throat-clearing phrase. You say at the present time, but you really could just say now. Due to the fact that could be replaced simply by because. Using positive language isn't always possible. I mean, there are certainly scenarios in which using a word with a negative connotation is necessary, but you want to try to avoid it to the extent possible. Instead of saying we apologize for the error, we appreciate you calling this matter to our attention, says the same basic message in a more positive tone. When criticizing somebody, rather than saying you made a mistake, you can say please remedy this for next time. Rather than saying that we refuse, say we're unable to grant the request at this time. Something to that effect. Sometimes you're not going to be able to mitigate what you say, but where you can, it's always better to do so. Some of the assignments may ask you to establish or send a positive or neutral message. As we discussed before, be as direct as possible and stick to the point. Whereas others, probably more of them, are persuasive messages where you're trying to convince somebody of something, or a bad news message, which really could be the same thing. A bad news message could be you're persuading somebody to do something that would otherwise be against their interests. This is a more difficult context. It may be a request that you have to convince the reader to comply with. Or you may be asking somebody to do something. Not necessarily bad news, but it's the sort of thing that you have to establish in your tone that you're requesting. A letter denying a promotion, also, etc., another example of a bad news message. Like with all writing, plagiarism is an important aspect to avoid, or an important thing to avoid, when you're talking about business writing. Plagiarism is essentially using somebody else's words or ideas without giving credit to the author. Here's the general rule. If you are quoting from somebody else, that could be from a textbook, it could be from the internet, it could be from Wikipedia, whatever it is. Whatever you're quoting from, you need to put quotes around whatever language you're using that you're quoting from, and you need to attribute whatever you're saying to that source. It's perfectly okay to use somebody else's words, but you need to tell the reader that those are somebody else's words. The other thing regarding plagiarism is that even if you're not using somebody else's words, if you're using somebody else's idea, if somebody else that you found in a book, online, in a newspaper, wherever, said this, and you then go ahead and tell your reader this, you need to say where you got this information from. If you read in the New York Times that 68% of Americans oppose the renewal of the Patriot Act, and then you tell the reader 68% of readers oppose the Patriot Act, that is plagiarism unless you tell the reader that you got that from the New York Times. Now you can cite that information using MLA styling, using APA styling, whatever the format is. The point is, whatever information that you got from somebody else that you tell the reader, you have to cite it. You have to give credit to wherever you actually found that information. Not only are you thereby being intellectually honest, but you're also bolstering your own credibility. If you just give a random statistic, the reader won't necessarily believe you. If you say you got the information from the New York Times, well, the reader still might not believe you, but at least the reader will know where you got the information from. And certainly if the reader respects the source that you got the information from, then you have a better chance of being believed by the reader. Methods of persuading somebody can be broken down into three categories: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is based on an appeal based on credibility. In other words, you're trying to convince the reader of something by saying that somebody with credibility said so. The president said XYZ. A great economist said ABC. A college professor said this, that, and the other thing. Therefore, you should believe the same thing. It's an appeal to authority. That's one way of trying to convince somebody of something. There's pathos, which is an appeal based on emotion. Trying to, wouldn't you do that if it were your child? How would you feel if it were your child? How would you feel if it happened to you? That's an appeal based on emotion. Then there's logos, which is an appeal based on logic. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way to argue. Each of these things can be used effectively, and each of these have different methods by which they work. In appeal based on credibility, you need to demonstrate good character and provide background and experience of whatever the source is. If it's you, well, then you want to establish your own background and experience and character to convince the reader that you are trustworthy in this area. If it's somebody that you're quoting, you want to establish the credentials of that person, excuse me. Pathos, which is an appeal based on emotion, you want to try to connect with your audience on an emotional level and use stories, use anecdotes, use imagery to tug at the heartstrings of your readers and thereby convince them based on an appeal to emotion. And then you have logos, which is an appeal based on logic, where you can use solid evidence and reasoning, provide facts, provide whatever thing that you believe your audience will logically draw your conclusion from. Again, you can use all of these, or any of these, really depending on your audience. If you're writing to high-end college professors, logos might be the only way to go because they've trained themselves not to think based on emotion, and maybe they don't believe in any higher authority for themselves. If you're speaking to an audience of emotional people, maybe pathos is the way to go. If you're speaking to children or people used to authority, maybe ethos is the way to go. Finally, we get to the purpose of a memo. A memo essentially is a document that tells somebody of a problem and tells somebody of what the potential solution is. There are many, many different types of memoranda that people write. They could be legal memoranda, they could be business memoranda. And the memo brings attention to the problems and tries to solve the problem. They also accomplish goals by informing the reader of things. Memorandum to explain the recent price increase, the recent salary decrease, whatever the case may be. One aspect of a memo is to limit the audience to people who actually need to read it. There may not necessarily be a point to send a good thing to send the memo to 10 other people in your office if really only 2 people need to read it. There may be other reasons why other people not directly impacted need to read it, but it's the sort of thing that you definitely need to consider. Be certain that the material is not too sensitive to put in a memo. If somebody's being fired, for example, you may not necessarily want to send it in a memo. Well, you may not want to send that in a memo altogether, but you may any kind of bad news message, certainly if you're going to send it to a large group of people, you need to consider whether everybody on the list needs to know it. A memo has a heading subject, to, from, date, and the subject. This is information that's not part of the writing itself, but it is part of it's the beginning of the memo. Memos, especially in the business context, should be formal. Whoever you're writing to, Dr. Smith, Dr. Gene Smith, whatever the case may be, rather than a nickname. The opening segment of a memo explains to the reader what the problem is and what the purpose of the memo is. The context and the problem, the specific assignment or task that you're trying to establish when you're using this memo. Choosing how specific your introduction will be, of course, depends on your specific memo style or plan. The more direct the memo, the more explicit your introduction should be. This is one of those things where there's not necessarily a right answer or a wrong answer, but if you're looking to solve a very specific problem, you're writing to explain why we should or should not drop the prices on boots during November, or whatever specifically you're looking for, the more specific your problem, the more specific you're going to be in your introduction. A memo should next have the context, which is you're setting the backdrop for whatever problem it is that you're trying to solve. You might say second quarter sales were down 18% year over year in 2016. And here you're establishing the context for the rest of your memo, which is going to be to try to explain how you're going to make sure that sales don't remain down. Your task segment is really the guts, the heart of your memo. This is where you say what it is that solves the problem. If you're trying to inform, say what your research has established. If you're trying to advise, say what your specific plan is. The task segment is where you do what you're setting out to do. Include as much information as is necessary, but don't ramble on with insignificant details or go into more detail than is really necessary, or, of course, go into irrelevancies. Once you finish with the task segment, now you can go to the summary segment. Goes through a brief review or a brief statement of the key recommendations you've made, and then you get into the discussion. This is where you go through why your idea that you discussed back in the task segment is a good idea and how it's going to work. And then finally you go through a closing statement, which you again briefly summarize the action that you want, and then any necessary attachments at the end. Attachments, of course, should include any documents that you're relying on as part of your message. And with that in mind, let's go through some of the assignments over here for this course. Assignment number 1, you are the head of the catalog sales department at Branford's, a large department store in Miami. Your 17 full-time employees are high school graduates. Many of them are female, of course. So this is part of the audience when you're going to think about your audience. For beginning workers, you pay $2.50 an hour over minimum wage plus fringe benefits, and you have to send a message to your employees informing them that management has decided that no one can take vacation or personal days during November or December because the holiday season is your biggest sales period. So, the first thing the assignment asks you to do is to answer some basic questions about your process. All of these are really related to the things that we just discussed. What is the purpose of your message? Well, of course, you want to convey an idea. You want to convey a statement to your readers, so you want to say this in a concise way. The purpose of your message is to inform them of something that I guess you could call it bad news. I mean, not ultra bad news, but certainly I guess you can call it informing them rather than necessarily, you're not necessarily worrying about convincing anybody of anything, or maybe you're going to convince them not to be upset, but you're looking to inform them. What is your audience? That's important in crafting your message. Whether you're going to go at it with ethos, logos, or pathos, whether you are going to avoid technical information, whether you are going to try to convince them based on numbers or based on whatever else the case may be, you need to establish who your audience are. Now, you can just say who your audience are, but what are their characteristics? Will you use a direct or indirect organizational plan? Remember, we just discussed in the slide, sometimes a more direct plan is advisable, sometimes a more indirect plan is advisable, and I think it's pretty clear what the answer is. I don't want to give you the answer, that's your job, but I think it's pretty clear what the answer is based on what we just discussed, is that this at least has the characteristic of a bad news message. What reasons can you give for your decision? Well, it tells you what the reason is. You may also want to mention that you would like to research and establish more facts to explain that. How can you stress the you attitude and use positive methods? There have to be ways to do that. I mean, think about it. Maybe, just to give you a hint, maybe you're looking to explain to them that you're protecting their jobs by doing what's in the long-term best interest for the company. And by doing what's in the long-term best interest for the company, that will be better for the employees in the long run. Would you format this as a letter or a memo? Remember, a memo goes through many more complex steps. I don't know if a lot of those are necessary over here. I mean, think about whether they're necessary. Do you need to have a discussion? Do you need to have a plan? Do you need to have all those other things that we discussed when we're talking about a memo? And then, after you answer this, the main part of the assignment is to compose your document. Now, the planning, drafting, revising, formatting, and proofreading is obviously something that you need to do by yourself. We're not going to look over that. You're not going to submit your original draft. You're not going to submit your plan or your outline or anything like that. But I think the end result of your message will show that you've done all of these. So when you actually write this document, let's call it a letter for the time being, when you actually write this letter, okay, what is it that you're trying to say? How are you going to establish it? When you're writing it, maybe a direct organizational plan would be a good idea. Now, we didn't discuss this previously, but a direct organizational plan, which is the sort of thing when you have a bad news message that's relatively insignificant and is considered routine, the reader might not necessarily be emotionally involved or seriously disappointed, so you may want to consider doing things that are consistent with this type of writing. You might want to emphasize the decision. You might want to be direct. Certainly you want to be concise, and you want to appeal to what you consider to be the thinking process of your audience. Consider your audience. Who are your audience? Based on who your audience are, think about whether to go at it from a logos perspective, from a purely logical perspective, from an ethos perspective, from an authority perspective, or from a pathos perspective. A logos perspective might try to convince the reader that if we don't have all hands on deck during the holiday season, and don't use the phrase all hands on deck, that's a colloquialism, that's a cliche that I told you before not to use. But then you might want to convince the reader that if we don't have everybody here, the company might not do well, and if the company might not do well, then you might not have the company might go out of business, and you might not have jobs, etc., etc. A logos way of that's a logos way of looking at it. A pathos way of looking at it, might express the unity and teamwork and being there for each other and doing what's best for all of us. Whereas an ethos perspective might be convincing the reader that you know the best strategy by virtue of the fact that you've been in the business. You're the boss. You have 17 full-time employees. You're the head of sales. You've gotten to this point, and you know what's best. Which aspect is best when you write this letter to your employees? There are certainly aspects that you can use, but in considering your audience, you might choose one method or the other above the others in writing about this problem and writing about your decision. Assignment 2 is about revising and rethinking something that was written perhaps poorly the first time around. You are given 2 emails over here by supervisors to subordinates, kind of similar in that respect to assignment number 1. First thing you want to do is you want to explain in a separate section why these emails are poorly worded, and then you'd like to draft replacement emails, which could be more than one. So for each one, we want a section explaining why these emails are bad and what can be improved, how you would improve them, and then we'd like you to take a crack at actually doing them. The first one starts off in a very negative tone. Remember we discussed before about that negativity? We didn't, even if you have to be negative, and certainly a criticism does have to be negative to some extent, you want to try to word it in a way that is as positive as possible. This person says, you all have no respect for our email system. Your inboxes are much too big. What about, do you see anything over here again? I don't want to do this assignment for you, but your assignments are much too big. And is that as specific as you think it needs to be? We discussed before the importance of writing things that are quantifiable, right? Rather than writing things that are vague, writing things that are as specific as possible and give the reader a clear understanding of, what numbers are acceptable. In fact, as you can see later on in the email, what the acceptable numbers are. It says in the next paragraph, if you have more than 250 messages, your inbox would be temporarily removed. Well, you got to wonder, why didn't the person in the first paragraph, rather than saying much too big, why didn't the person use that quantity, which was obviously available in establishing? Big problem. Was that a good title? I don't know if that was such a good title. I have better things to do with an exclamation point. That's kind of condescending. Also, big email inboxes slow down the server. Again, very non-quantifiable, almost like just a gripe rather than a constructive comment. Starting tomorrow, we will check all inboxes. If you have more than 250 messages, then your inbox will be temporarily removed, and you'll have to follow instructions in order to get it back. Kind of a run-on sentence and all that. This is easy to avoid. Just take a few precious minutes out of the day, move email folders where they belong, or delete them. And then he writes a memo to the entire office, to the entire IT department, and takes a moment to take a swipe at Corey Shields, who has the biggest inbox with 6,921 messages. We discussed a lot of principles previously in terms of who to send the emails to, who to include in a memo, positivity, specificness, and these emails kind of violate all of them. This is not meant to be that hard in terms of figuring out what was wrong. The second email really is not that much better. This is about expense reports. And I'm looking at your expense reports, and it's making me crazy. Again, that's it's an exaggeration, and it's not literally making him crazy. Hopefully, so it's an exaggeration. It's a little hyperbole. It's the sort of thing that is maybe appropriate when you're talking informally, but not really appropriate in a business communication. I'm finding expensive cab rides, meal reports, blah blah blah. Why take a cab for $25 when you could take a shuttle instead for less than half that? Again, doesn't really, that actually is pretty good in terms of quantifying information, but there's a lot of stuff here that doesn't quantify things. I don't have time to send emails individually. Well, that's your job, kind of. All right, Sam, why take a $30 taxi to the hotel? Anyway, so he goes through. He doesn't explain things. He says max for a cell phone is $50, not $67. Well, that's being too concise. That's not really quantifying anything. So when you rewrite these, criticizing this is the easy part. I mean, anybody can criticize these. There are some really terrible things about the way these emails are written. When you rewrite these, which is really the heart of the assignment, to rewrite these things, look at the things that we discussed on those slides about being positive, about being specific, about choosing your audience, about about bad news messages or criticism, about not being so negative, being only as negative as is necessary. And doing that, once you write these emails, again, as said in the instructions, you might want to separate these into separate emails, which you certainly can. Although I've seen students submit things like this, and sometimes they don't. When they do the separate emails, they don't give each reader a synopsis of what's going on. Obviously, if you're going to send out 5 different emails over here, you need to have each email have a comprehensive discussion about what the problem is. It doesn't mean you can't copy and paste from one to another. But if you're writing Sam specifically, well, then Sam has to understand what the problem with why there's a problem, and then Peter has to understand why there's a problem, and you might want to do separate emails to each individual. You might want to say, by the way, to each individual, you might, for example, say there have been problems with many different people's expense reports, just in order to emphasize that there's a problem of immediacy. When you're talking to Peter, for example, the only specific problem maybe you're going to tell Peter is about the $72 lunch. You're not going to mention that Sam took a taxi that was too expensive, but you might tell Peter that there have been many other issues and many other problems that have come up, just in order to establish the urgency of this message and in Peter's taking this message seriously. Assignment 3 is your classic assignment to write a bad newsletter. We've got Yippee Incorporated, a fictitious company based in Vallejo, California, that provides various services for users, including to store video and audio files. Anyway, in April of 2015, the company decided to cease its services due to intense competition from companies like YouTube and Hulu and Vimeo. They just had declined. Currently, 18 people work for YouTube's video streaming department, which will be eliminated. Yippee is committed to doing everything possible to find positions for these 18 people in other departments of the company, and will stop hiring external people so that these employees can be used to fill any spots open in other departments. In other words, if a different department has a job, priority will go to one of these 18 people, and they will also be offering job placement assistance for people who will not be able to hang on with the company. Your job, not an easy job, but a job that hopefully you'll be able to do based on this course and based on the discussions that we had before, is to draft an email memorandum. This is a memo, remember, not a letter, that will be sent to all 18 of them. There's no reason to distinguish between any of the recipients like we did in the previous assignments, letting them know the bad news and giving them the essentials of the information. Please make the email sound as nice and calming as possible, and you can make up any reasonable facts and circumstances you believe necessary to complete this assignment. Obviously, one of the things when you're doing a bad news message, and we discussed this before, is that you want to use an indirect approach. Don't come right out and say, "Dear everybody, you're all fired." You can say something like, you can explain a little bit about the background first and kind of lead up to it. Use supporting evidence. Don't just say, "We just can no longer afford to hold on to you." There's other factors out there that compel us to do this. You can mention the facts about YouTube. You can mention the facts about Vimeo. If you want to go online and then look up historical data about how fast YouTube has grown and how fast Vimeo has grown over the last few years, and you want to use that in your paper, that's fine. I don't think you necessarily have to. I mean, the paper actually gives you the direction that you can make things up a little bit if you want to, but if you want to find real live data, that's going above and beyond. But you want to be clear, obviously. You want to be direct, and you also want to give the people information that is going to convince them that it's necessary, and maybe allow them to take the silver lining a little bit. Obviously, you want to emphasize the fact that you're giving placement services. You want to emphasize the fact that you're going to try to give these people jobs in other places in the company. And I think the memo style is perfect for this sort of thing, where you have a problem, you're laying out the problem. The problem, of course, is, kind of in your introduction, you're establishing that the video department hasn't done well because of reasons X, Y, Z. And later on, when you get to the solutions part, you're telling unfortunately, you have no choice but to tell the people that they're all going to have to find other positions, but you can mention the placement assistance services and allowing them to try to go get other jobs with other parts of the company. Now, this 300 to 600 words long is not very long. You don't have to write. I think we discussed before in the memo. There were 6 different sections with the summary. You're not going to have time for all that in a 300 to 600 word essay. And if you want to write a 1,000 word essay, it's not the end of the world. You're not going to fail because of that. But the thing is, so you don't have to write all the different sections of a memo, but the elements are important. Establishing what the problem is, establishing what's going to happen by virtue of the problem, and establishing what you're going to try to do to make it go as smoothly as possible are all important elements of your writing this essay. Assignment 4 is even more of a formal memo than Assignment 3. Assignment 4 is a typical memo where you're informing somebody of something. You're going to want to give some background to start, explain to the reader why it is that you're there, give the reader a synopsis of what your research has indicated, and then a discussion of your potential solutions. Here we have an issue where the manufacturing facility where you work employs 3 data entry operators who work full-time keyboarding, etc. Okay, last year, essentially, long story short, one of them contracted carpal tunnel syndrome, which is a neuromuscular disorder of the tendons and tissue of the wrist caused by repeated hand motions. Certainly, it's the sort of thing that affects people that type a lot. The company, of course, anticipates further automation in the future with more data entry operators. Your boss has asked you to gather information on this. Now, of course, part of this assignment is for you to do some research. You can do research on carpal tunnel syndrome by getting a book on it. You can do research on carpal tunnel syndrome by researching it online. You can get it from pretty much, from an encyclopedia. You can get it from pretty much anywhere you like, but getting some information about what this is and whatever potential solutions there are, and it's not going to be that difficult to find. I mean, literature about carpal tunnel syndrome is ubiquitous. It's all over the place. Getting some solutions here, it's not really the point. We're not really asking you to do this because we want to see your research skills in terms of finding solutions to carpal tunnel syndrome. Without knowing more about this company, they would be extremely easy in terms of things like posture, furniture, work habits, getting better furniture, giving people breaks, whatever would help. That's not really the point of this assignment. What we want to see is the process that you use and how you put it into a memo. That's really what we're looking for. We're not looking for any brilliancies in terms of research. So here we're just asking for a report. Now, it says it in 2 separate sections, process and product, but here, unlike some of the assignments before, there's really only one stage that you're going to need to do. We don't need to see answers to the questions or answers to the process and a product. The process is part of the product. Whatever you are writing, your memo, your report on this issue is going to include all of these things. The problem statement and subproblems for your report. Okay, well, what's the problem here? Well, the problem, of course, is that our data entry employees, are suffering from carpal tunnel syndrome, and we need to figure out a way to protect our employees and protect ourselves from being sued, and figure out a way to help that problem. How you gathered the needed secondary data. Well, again, you can look it up in an encyclopedia, you can look it up online, you can look it up pretty much anywhere you like, and you can just find some basic information about carpal tunnel syndrome. How you evaluated the quality and relevance of data you collected. That's another element of this course. This is, again, something that we didn't look at before necessarily, but evaluating the quality, and this has an internet source, but of course this applies whether you're talking about an internet source or an in-print source. You want to look at its authority, its accuracy, It's objectivity and it's currentness. The authority is, okay, who wrote the web page? Now, you might have seen that carpal tunnel syndrome is cured XYZ, but, who wrote that? Was it a furniture store that wrote that? Was it the National Association of Carpal Tunnel Syndrome Prevention that wrote it? Again, I don't know if that exists, but the point is, who wrote the material? Was there contact information in the book or on the website? And is this material protected by a copyright? Not that that necessarily applies to whether it's accurate or not, but that's certainly at least a factor in terms of that it was published with authority. Accuracy. Is there any way that you can determine its accuracy? Is the site sloppy with grammatical errors? That might indicate a sloppiness which could carry over to accuracy. Does anyone monitor the information? Is this a company that is a government-sponsored organization? Is this a company that is part of a university research group? Certainly, if there was something published in a medical journal, something published in the New England Journal of Medicine or something like that, you can rely on the fact that this probably was peer-reviewed and it was agreed to by other people before it went into publication, by an institutional review board of a university or whatever it is. Was it objective? Was there bias over here? If the solution that you found to carpal tunnel syndrome, and the solution that you're going to use is that you're going to buy everybody these pads that rests the bottom of their hands when they're typing, but the source that told you that was a good idea is the seller of those pads. It could be true. There's nothing inherently wrong with that information, but it may not be totally objective. May not be the best source to use. At least you want to discuss that. You might say, for example, that there's a problem with objectivity, but still, based on the information, I still think it's valid. Again, nothing inherently wrong with that. Just because information is biased doesn't inherently mean that it's false. It just means that it may not be as reliable. You may want to confirm it with other sources. And of course, currentness. You want to make sure that whatever information you're looking at is information from relatively recently rather than information from 20 years ago. So, how you evaluated the quality, how you decided whether to use a direct or indirect organizational plan. Remember, we discussed before about the distinction, something that you think will be received well, you want to use a little bit more direct, something that you think might be met with skepticism or consternation, you may want to be a little bit more indirect to make it a little bit more palatable. The degree of formality that you want to use, remember you're writing a memorandum to your boss, that's important, and the factors you use to determine whether to include any visual aids when you're making the presentation, also something that's covered in this course. You don't have to prepare the visual aids for this assignment, but what we would like you to do is to write the report with all of this information. I used this source. This source was reliable because of XYZ. It was current. It was authoritative. And because of what I've established in all these sources, you give a summary of your recommendations. I recommend that people take 10-minute breaks every hour or whatever. Well, anyway, whatever your recommendations are, and of course those should be based on whatever research you put into your report. The last assignment is almost the ultimate in a persuasive writing. The last assignment is essentially convincing somebody that they should give you a job. What's more important than persuading somebody to give you a job? Your first job is to go out and find a job listing that you're interested in. Don't just find a random job listing. Don't just necessarily find a job listing for a bricklayer and say, okay, I want to convince somebody to make me a bricklayer. If you're not interested in that, believe me, if you write to apply to a job that you're not passionate about and that you don't really care about, that will come through in your writing. Your grader, your reader will be able to tell that your heart is not in it. So pick something that you're really interested in. And again, this is not necessarily in real life, so you don't have to actually apply to a job that you're qualified for. If your dream is to be an astronaut and you want to apply for an open job that you found in a newspaper to go be an astronaut, you can do that. And of course, you can make up credentials if you like. This is not about applying for a real job. This is about writing, assuming that you have information. Although, if you want to use real life information, that might even be better because it'll train you to use the facts that you're dealt. If you write, well, I graduated from Harvard Medical School first in my class. Well, that's the sort of thing you might not necessarily have in real life, that kind of credential to lean back on. So at least I would suggest using realistic information and realistic qualifications. But you know what? We're not going to check it. If you want to write that, that you were the president of the Maine Zoological Society, we're not going to go call up the Maine Zoological Society and make sure you were really president. So you can pretty much use whatever information you like, but we suggest that you make it as realistic as possible. So the job listing can be from the internet, it can be from a local paper, it doesn't matter. Prepare a cover letter that you would send to apply to that position. You don't have to include your resume, but what we want you to do is to establish a cover letter. And a cover letter is the ultimate in persuasive writing. We discussed a lot about being concise, about being clear, about being positive, about not using cliches. Don't say hire me, I'm the bee's knees. I mean, if you do that, you're not getting the job. It's almost a guarantee. Don't use cheesy cliches. Use concise and direct and powerful and vigorous writing. And that's what make good cover letters. All the points that we discussed in terms of business writing. You should introduce yourself, say who you are in a concise way, list your credentials, express an interest in the position, and explain why you would be a good fit for the position. What about your personality? Aside from your credentials, don't just say, "Well, I would be a good fit for my position because I graduated from law school last year, and this is a lawyer job." I mean, yeah, okay, that's true. That may be a necessary credential, but everybody else applying for the job also graduated from law school, or almost everybody applying for the job. So, just you saying that you're qualified, well, it's important. It's not the end. Okay, what about you makes it a good fit for this position? I enjoy being a team player, and this is a large firm. I have experience that's specifically unique to this position based on XYZ. I have a passion for the kind of work you are doing. Discuss something about the company and why you want to work for that company specifically. If you can do some research and find out real facts about that company that allows you to do this in a realistic manner, that's fantastic. If you can't and you need to make something up, it's not the end of the world, that's fine also. But again, I think you'll gain the most from this assignment if you're as realistic as possible. Use all the persuasive writing tools and tricks and techniques that we've discussed in this course, and then also try to tie that specifically to you. And then you can use that information. Just in terms, obviously, be as persuasive as possible. Write something more than explain in the cover letter why you're qualified, but that's probably the more minor point. The major point of the cover letter is why you're more adept for that position, why you're more appropriate for that position than everybody else who's applied for it, who's also qualified. Don't assume that you're the only qualified person applying for a job. You're probably not. So try to explain, identify yourself, describe your credentials, explain that you're very interested. That's part of it. That's part of applying for a job. If you can convince the person reading it that you're really interested in the job and you really, really want it, well, that's not the only. Doesn't mean you're going to get it, but you're going to have a big advantage over somebody who looks kind of nonchalant. Somebody who looks kind of. Employers don't want people who are nonchalant. Employers don't want people who don't. Sometimes there's a temptation to make it look like you don't need the job, so you think that they'll want you. It's not really the way it works. The way it really works is that if they think that you're not so interested in the job, they'll say, well, that person's not going to bring a passion to this job, and therefore I'm going to give it to somebody else who is passionate. Okay, so good luck with the assignments. Let us know if you have any questions, and thank you for watching.